April 18th, 1943, 6 o'clock Tokyo time. The morning air over Rabaul shimmered with the metallic throb of propellers as two Mitsubishi G4M1 Betty bombers rolled down the coral strip of Lakunai airfield. The twin-engine machines were light, fast, and fatally fragile, thin aluminum skin stretched over fuel tanks that turned them into flying lanterns. In the lead aircraft sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the man who had conceived the attack on Pearl Harbor and who lived by the clock. He wore his white gloves, his field cap precisely tilted, and his staff papers stacked beside him on the seat. At 6 sharp, the throttles went forward, and the bombers lifted into the pale light, bound for an inspection tour of the Northern Solomons. Across the Pacific, the echo of this departure had already begun to move. In a windowless room at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts had broken yet another fragment of the Japanese Navy's operational cipher code, JN-25D. Among the sterile rows of typewritten numbers, one message stood out, NTF 131755. It detailed Yamamoto's flight plan with a precision no commander should ever have risked: route, time of departure, altitude, even the exact minute of arrival at Balalae airstrip. When Commander Joseph Rochefort read it aloud, the room fell silent. The architect of Pearl Harbor had placed his life inside an unguarded message. The intelligence moved upward through channels at electric speed. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King insisted the intercept was genuine. President Franklin Roosevelt agreed. "Get Yamamoto," he said simply. The directive reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, who passed it to Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific area. Halsey understood both the opportunity and the risk. To kill the enemy's greatest naval strategist inside Japanese-held territory meant violating every rule of caution. One slip, one leak, and the codebreaker's secret advantage would vanish. The orders therefore went out under absolute silence. No one was to mention intercepted communications. The pilots would be told the target had been spotted by coastwatchers. On Guadalcanal, in the humid heat of Kukum Field, the chosen squadron waited for word. It was the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 13th Air Force, a handful of men and machines that possessed one rare advantage: range. Their aircraft, the Lockheed P-Thirty-Eight Lightning, could fly farther than any other American fighter in the Pacific. Twin booms stretched behind each cockpit like the tail of a predatory bird. Between them hung an engine nacelle with a 37mm cannon and 4 50-caliber guns. With drop tanks hung under the wings, the Lightning could reach Bougainville and limp home again barely. Major John W. Mitchell, a tall Missourian with the calm of an engineer and the instincts of a gambler, gathered his flight leaders inside a bamboo-walled operations hut. He did not tell them who their prey was. The briefing board showed only a thin red line looping 600 miles across the Solomon Sea, arcing north, then bending east into enemy skies. The mission profile was insane: 4 hours over open water at treetop height, without radio chatter, with just enough fuel for combat and return, if every calculation proved correct. Mitchell explained the plan in clipped tones. "We meet the target at 10:35, not 10:34, not 10:36. If we're early, we're spotted. If we're late, he's gone." Around him stood pilots who had learned to survive the jungle war: Thomas Lanphier Jr., the showman; Rex Barber, quiet and methodical; Besby Holmes, dry humor masking nerves; and Raymond Hine, reliable as a compass. They nodded, trying to hide the unease curling in their stomachs. Each man would fly a Lightning armed with 1,000 rounds of ammunition and carrying 2 external tanks, one 165-gallon on the left, one 310 on the right. The asymmetry would make the aircraft wallow until the first tank emptied, but it was the only way to stretch the range. Outside, mechanics tightened bolts and checked fuel seals under flickering lamps. The island's humidity fouled spark plugs. Salt mist corroded gun sights. Ground Crew Chief Sergeant Joseph DiGiorgio muttered that a P-38's twin Allison engines could betray any error with a sudden cough and flame. Every man knew the truth. This mission left no margin for mechanical failure. In the operations tent, Mitchell sat at a folding table with a ruler, a compass, and a pencil. The map was spread across his knees, a line traced from Guadalcanal to Bougainville's southern coast. There were no radio beacons, no radar vectors. Navigation would be dead reckoning. Maintain a fixed heading, correct for drift, and hope the calculations matched the world. He computed wind direction, ground speed, and fuel burn at 27 inches of manifold pressure and 1,600 revolutions per minute. The numbers became his only allies. At dawn, on April 18th, clouds drifted low over the island. Mitchell climbed into his cockpit, adjusted the straps, and tapped the glass face of his wristwatch. 0620 local. Engines ignited in succession, coughing smoke. 17 Lightnings were scheduled. 2 failed before taxi. Lieutenant McClanahan's right main tire burst. Lieutenant Moore's fuel line clogged with sediment. That left 15. The remaining aircraft lumbered down the strip in pairs, props biting the morning air. Once airborne, they banked north and dropped to 50 feet above the sea, weaving between green islands whose names most of the pilots could not pronounce. The Pacific stretched in a seamless plain, sun glare turning water into blinding mirrors. The radio discipline was absolute. Only. Mitchell's voice occasionally broke the static. Check drop tank feed, RPM steady, maintain heading 248. Below, waves burst white against coral reefs. Above, the sky deepened to cobalt. Each man knew that if one engine failed, ditching meant capture or worse. Japanese patrol boats scoured the area. Coastwatchers on Bougainville reported entire crews executed on the spot, yet no one turned back. In Washington, a clock ticked toward 9:35 local time in Tokyo. At that exact moment, 6,000 miles away, Mitchell's formation was crossing the final navigation point, Empress Augusta Bay. The math held true. Ahead lay the rendezvous, somewhere over Bougainville's northern jungle, invisible beneath the morning haze. The Americans had made the impossible flight, unseen, unfollowed. At 7 minutes past 9, Admiral Yamamoto's bomber formation cleared the tip of Bougainville, descending to low altitude for approach to Balalae. Inside the lead, Betty, Yamamoto looked down upon the island canopy and the sparkling reef. His aide, Commander Fujita, noted the time in his log, 0907 on schedule. He could not know that far to the south, at that very minute. 15 silver shapes were knifing through the air toward him, each guided not by luck, but by a series of numbers scribbled on a kneeboard in graphite pencil. Back on Guadalcanal, Admiral Marc Mitscher stood beside the radio shack, a cigar burning to ash between his fingers. He had given the quiet order hours earlier, execute vengeance. Now there was nothing to do but wait for static to speak. Above the Pacific, the lightnings flew into the rising sun, engines droning in harmony like distant thunder. Every man in that formation knew he was gambling his life on mathematics, on secrecy, and on the fragile wings of a machine built half a world away. The mission had no precedent, no fallback, and no promise of return. Yet they pressed on, invisible specks, against the blue. Somewhere ahead, beyond 600 miles of ocean and jungle, a single man sat in a green bomber seat, punctual to the minute. The sky between them was measured not in distance, but in fate, a straight line drawn by intelligence, courage, and calculation, soon to intersect in fire. April 18th, 1943. The P-38 Lightnings skimmed the ocean, no higher than 50 feet, their twin shadows sliding across the blue. Each pilot knew that a single mistake 1 degree off course, 1 knot too fast, would turn the mission into a death sentence. Major John W. Mitchell had built the plan with the precision of a surveyor and the calm of a man hiding fear beneath arithmetic. The math had to be perfect. From Guadalcanal to Bougainville and back was over 600 miles, farther than any American fighter had ever flown in combat. Their engines, twin Allison V-12 liquid-cooled monsters, could devour 2 gallons a minute if leaned too far, or if The mixture ran too rich. Every drop of fuel mattered. Mitchell had calculated throttle settings for each leg of the flight cruise at 26 inches, manifold pressure, 1,600 revolutions per minute, lean mixture, drop tanks feeding first. Even a 5-minute climb to altitude could waste 40 gallons, enough to strand them in the Pacific. The P-38's long legs came from design brilliance and desperation. Lockheed's engineers in Burbank had given the aircraft a wingspan of 52 feet, turbo superchargers tucked inside the twin booms, and range tanks large enough to cross an ocean. It was the only Allied fighter in the theater capable of this strike. Navy Wildcats and Marine Corsairs could never make the reach. The Lightning's twin engines offered power and a slim promise of survival. If one failed, the other might limp them home. But the irony was cruel. If either engine caught fire, the long ferry tanks would turn the plane into a torch. Mitchell's formation flew in two elements: the killer section of 4 Lightnings that would engage the target, and 11 cover fighters to hold off any interceptors. Radio silence was absolute. The only sounds were wind and the mechanical heartbeat of synchronized pistons. The pilots couldn't see one another through the sea haze, only the dim silhouette of the leader's tail flashing silver ahead. At 2 hours into the flight, they crossed over New Georgia. Beneath them, the jungle canopy looked like crushed velvet. Mitchell glanced at his fuel gauge, still holding within 5 gallons of expectation. The timing line in his head ticked forward. They would arrive over the intercept point at precisely 10:34 local. 1 minute early meant the ambush would fail. 1 minute late and Yamamoto would already be gone. Inside each cockpit, the world had narrowed to gauges and nerves. Lieutenant Thomas Lanphier later said, "The monotony was worse than fear hours of haze. Staring at endless ocean, every vibration from the engines a possible omen." His wingman, Lieutenant Rex Barber, kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for the faintest break of cloud that might betray a Japanese patrol. None appeared. Far ahead, Yamamoto's formation continued northward unaware. The admiral, who had studied in the United States and spoke English fluently, believed in precision as the highest military virtue. He had scheduled his inspection tour to the minute: depart Rabaul at 6, land at Balalae at 9:45, address his officers, and return by afternoon. His aide, Commander Fujita, carried the itinerary in his briefcase. Neither man knew that the Americans had read it. Back on Guadalcanal, Admiral Marc Mitscher stood outside the radio shack, watching the horizon brighten. He had written the order himself, 2 words only: execute vengeance. The phrase came from the decrypted message's Navy file label, NTF 13-1755, but among the staff, it had become myth already. If the mission failed, the Japanese would know their codes were broken. If it succeeded, the Pacific War would lose its most calculating mind. At 3 hours out, the first problem appeared. The left drop tank on Barber's Lightning refused to feed. He tapped the gauge, still full. The line must have vapor-locked. Procedure dictated jettison, but that would shorten his range fatally. He reached under the throttle quadrant, rapped the feed valve with his gloved knuckle, and the fuel began to flow. Relief swept through him like cold air. To conserve gasoline, the Lightnings flew on the step, nose slightly down, using momentum instead of throttle to hold speed. It was a delicate dance. Too low, and a wave crest could tear the belly open; too high and drag would devour fuel. Mitchell held altitude by instinct, feeling the air through his seat rather than trusting the altimeter. He checked his watch. 3 hours, 22 minutes. They were on schedule. Behind him, Lieutenant Raymond Hine held the trailing slot. Hine was steady, dependable, a pilot others trusted without question. He kept formation with Holmes, watching for stragglers. If any Lightning faltered, the others would not turn back. The mission's success depended on unity. As the coastline of Bougainville began to rise from the mist, Mitchell gave the only radio call of the flight. 30 seconds to climb. The formation pulled up from wavetop height, engines groaning. At 200 feet, the world opened a vast quilt of emerald jungle and pale rivers. Mitchell adjusted heading 283 degrees. Somewhere beyond those ridges, 6 Japanese Zeros escorted 2 twin-engine bombers. In one of them, Yamamoto sat reading a dispatch, unaware that a dozen Americans were converging upon his position by mathematics alone. For a heartbeat, the Pacific seemed empty, peaceful. The Lightnings leveled off at altitude, their canopies flashing sunlight. Then, faintly at first, came the buzz of engines to the north. Mitchell keyed his mic once, a single syllable, contact. From that word onward, the mission shifted from calculation to chaos. Above the dense green slopes of Bougainville, the hunters had found their prey. April 18th, 1943, 10:34 local time. Over the northern coast of Bougainville, 2 columns of smoke trailed faintly from a pair of Japanese Mitsubishi G4M1 Betty bombers, their twin radial engines droning in perfect rhythm. They were flanked by 6 Zero fighters, forming a loose protective umbrella. Below, the jungle rolled like green surf toward the coast of Moila Point. High above the treetops and to the south, 15 Lockheed P-Thirty-Eight Lightnings burst through the haze exactly on schedule. Major John W. Mitchell, leading from the left seat of Lightning Yippee, caught sight of them first 2 silver crosses, moving steadily across the sky, precisely where the decrypted coordinates had said they would be. The mission had reached its moment of truth. Mitchell's voice crackled across the radio. "There they are, boys. Let's get 'em." 4 Lightnings broke away the designated kill section. Lieutenants Thomas G. Lanphier, Jr., Rex T. Barber, Besby F. Holmes, and Raymond K. Hine. Mitchell's section arced wide, throttles full forward, engines howling in synchronized fury. Lanphier later remembered the moment as both infinite and instantaneous. "They were right where they were supposed to be," he said. 2 bombers, sunlight glinting on the glass. You could almost see the uniforms through the canopy. He nosed down and advanced the throttles to 45 inches manifold pressure, diving at over 400 miles per hour. The Bettys began evasive action immediately. The lead bomber Yamamoto's aircraft banked left, descending toward the jungle canopy. Its escorting Zeros dropped behind to cover, but they were seconds too slow. Barber and Lanphier split their attack. Barber aimed for the leader. Lanphier swung to meet the trailing bomber. Holmes and Hine dived behind them to cut off escape. From Barber's gun camera came the most decisive seconds of the Pacific Air War. At 300 yards, he opened fire, a steady burst from 450 caliber machine guns and 1 cannon. The rounds tore through the Betty's right engine, which erupted into flame. The aircraft rolled left, then dropped nose first through the trees. Barber climbed steeply to avoid collision. Witnesses later on the ground said the bomber exploded on impact, scattering fragments across 100 yards of jungle. Lanphier's target, the second Betty, tried to climb, its pilot banking sharply to avoid the flaming wreck of the first. Lanphier turned into him and fired a long burst. The left wing sheared away, the bomber cartwheeled, downward, striking the forest canopy and disintegrating. The sky above Bougainville erupted into chaos. The escorting Zeros dove on the Americans with savage precision. Hine's Lightning vanished in a burst of smoke hit by cannon fire. His wingman Holmes shouted over the radio, "Hine's hit! I'm on his tail!" But there was no reply. Hine's aircraft spiraled down into the jungle, disappearing without trace. For 10 minutes, the battle whirled through cloud and sunlight. Barber's Lightning took a glancing hit across the right boom but held together. Lanphier claimed a Zero destroyed before pulling away toward the sea. Holmes, running low on ammunition, dove for cloud cover. Mitchell's covering section kept the remaining Zeros occupied long enough for the strike element to disengage. At 10:45, the Americans broke contact. The ambush had lasted less than 12 minutes, Mitchell called for formation. All sections rally southeast. Static answered him. The formation was scattered, stretched thin by fuel and distance. Only 12 Lightnings responded. 3, including Hines, were missing. As the Americans turned south toward Guadalcanal, the jungle below burned. Near Moila Point, local villagers later recalled hearing a tremendous crash followed by secondary explosions. When they reached the wreckage, they found the twisted remains of a twin-engine bomber split by fire. Among the bodies lay one man still seated upright, his sidearm holstered, his white gloves scorched but intact. In his breast pocket, beneath the charred uniform, was an identification tag. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief, Combined Fleet. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the blow was beyond comprehension. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had symbolized Japan's naval intellect, was gone. His watch had stopped at 9:45 Tokyo time, the exact minute Barber's bullet struck his bomber. As Mitchell's surviving Lightnings droned, homeward, fuel gauges sank toward empty. Holmes's aircraft sputtered before sighting Guadalcanal. He glided across the beach and rolled to a stop with both engines dry. Barber landed next, his right boom streaked with oil. Lanphier arrived minutes later, grinning under his oxygen mask but pale with exhaustion. When the crews climbed down, Admiral Marc Mitscher was waiting at the edge of the runway. "Did you get him?" he asked. Barber nodded once. "We got him." No one spoke for a long moment. Mitscher simply said, "Then let's never speak of how." Official reports filed that evening were vague. The pilots were told to describe their target as a naval inspection aircraft, sighted by coastwatchers. The word code break was never written. Even the after-action debrief avoided names. In Washington, President Roosevelt received the news with a single line from the Pacific Command. The mission succeeded. The cost was high. 3 American pilots did not return. 1. Lightning lay shattered in Bougainville's jungle beside the admiral it had hunted. Yet the result reshaped the Pacific War. Without Yamamoto, Japan's strategic coherence began to fracture. Admiral Minachi Koga succeeded him but lacked his authority. Coordination between the fleet and army withered. In the days that followed, Japanese search parties combed the crash site under heavy security. On April 21st, the body was brought back to Rabaul under guard. His funeral in Tokyo was broadcast nationwide, yet the true circumstances of his death remained hidden from the public. Official communiques spoke only of an air combat incident over the Solomons. For the men of the 339th, the mission was over but not forgotten. In later years, controversy would swirl over who had fired the fatal burst, Barber or Lanphier. But among those who had flown the 600-mile gauntlet that morning, the argument mattered little. They had risked everything on mathematics, courage, and silence, and returned with history itself carved into the jungle. Above Bougainville, the smoke faded by afternoon, leaving only the wreckage of 2 bombers and the echo of an event that would reach from that humid island to the highest levels of Tokyo and Washington alike. April 19th, 1943. Dawn rose grey over the jungle ridges of southern Bougainville. Mist clung to the canopy, turning sunlight into thin gold ribbons that lanced through smoke still drifting from the crash site at Moila Point. From the beach, native villagers followed the scent of burning aviation fuel into the trees, guided by parrots shrieking from the disturbance. What they found that morning was not merely wreckage, it was the end of a man whose name had once terrified oceans. The Betty bomber lay split in 2, its wings sheared by impact. One of its engines had buried itself in the soil like a twisted monument. Bodies lay scattered among the roots. In the forward section, still upright in his seat, sat a man in a torn white uniform, his sword scabbard bent beneath him. His head rested against his chest, as though he had fallen asleep mid-command. It was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. From Rabaul, a Japanese search party launched within hours of his disappearance. The flight leader, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Kuroiwa, located the smoke column at midday. His men waded through the jungle in silence until they reached the clearing. When they saw their commander, even hardened veterans of Guadalcanal knelt. They covered his body with his flight jacket and carried him on their shoulders back to the coast. At Rabaul, Rear Admiral Kusaka confirmed the identification. Yamamoto's watch had stopped at 9:45 Tokyo time the moment his plane hit the forest. His aide, Commander Fujita, had also been killed instantly. The second Betty, which had attempted to climb, had crashed into the sea several miles east. Only 2 survivors were pulled from the water by patrol boats. Both confirmed that American fighters had come from nowhere, perfectly timed. News of Yamamoto's death was withheld from the public. The Emperor himself was informed that night. For the Japanese Navy, it was as though the sun had dimmed. The Admiral had been more than a strategist, he was the embodiment of naval honor. His officers called him Teikoku no Tamashi, the soul of the empire. To reveal his loss immediately would, they feared, shatter morale. His death was announced only on May 21st, after the combined fleet had reorganized under Admiral Minachi Koga. By then, the truth had already spread through whispers and coded radio calls. The Dragon of Pearl Harbor has fallen. On Guadalcanal, secrecy wrapped the American camp like a fog. Officially, the mission had never happened. Major John W. Mitchell filed his after-action report with careful phrasing, no mention of code breaks, no reference to the decrypted itinerary. The pilots were told to attribute their interception to information supplied by coastwatchers. In Washington, Admiral Nimitz's communique to the White House contained only 10 words. Target eliminated. No compromise of intelligence sources indicated. Yet within the 13th Fighter Command tent, silence could not erase the memory of what they had seen. Lieutenant Rex Barber, whose gun camera footage showed the first Betty breaking apart, sat alone that evening cleaning the barrels of his Lightning. He had lost his wingman, Raymond Hine, somewhere over Bougainville. "We got him," Barber murmured to the mechanic who brought him coffee, "but we paid the price. Hine's family would not learn his fate for months. His remains were never recovered." Lieutenant Thomas Lanphier wrote his report differently. He claimed the fatal shot himself, stating that he had attacked the lead bomber head-on and that his burst had ignited Yamamoto's cockpit. Barber disagreed. Holmes, who had seen both attacks, and from below, believed Barber's side fire had struck first. The argument began quietly but would echo for decades, long after both men had left the service. The wreckage at Moyla Point became legend. Japanese engineers salvaged fragments of the Admiral's plane for study evidence of bullet trajectories, fuel line rupture, and the angle of descent. Their report, now preserved in the Japanese National Defense Archives, noted that the bomber had been struck primarily from the right and slightly above, consistent with Barber's attack vector. But wartime propaganda preferred simplicity, and the official narrative credited all involved pilots equally. Back in Tokyo, Yamamoto's body was cremated under military honors. His ashes were divided, half interred at the Tama Cemetery, half returned to his birthplace of Nagaoka. The funeral procession stretched for miles, black banners rippling down avenues that had once celebrated naval victories. The announcer on Radio Tokyo's evening broadcast spoke in trembling tones. "The spirit of Admiral Yamamoto will guide our fleet eternally." Yet those who understood war also understood finality. Japan had lost the only man who had warned, in 1941, that he could run wild for 6 months, but after that, I have no expectation of success. In the United States, the details of Operation Vengeance remained sealed. President Roosevelt made no public statement, but within the Pentagon, the mission became a case study in the union of intelligence and precision. Colonel Earl Johnson of the Air Force's Operations Division wrote, "It was not merely assassination. It was the execution of mathematics and nerve, a demonstration that reach, when guided by code, could destroy the brain of an empire." For the men who had flown it, there was no celebration. When Major Mitchell gathered his surviving pilots 2 days later, he offered no speech. "We did our job," he said simply. "Now forget it." The mission. Files were locked in a steel cabinet under ultra-secret classification, not to be released until long after the war. but memory has its own momentum. In mess halls and squadron tents, the pilots whispered fragments: the low flight, the sudden burst of sunlight on silver wings, the moment of contact. Mechanics joked grimly that the lightnings struck true. And somewhere in Bougainville's jungle, beneath a canopy that would swallow all traces within months, the twisted fuselage of a Japanese bomber rusted among vines, its cockpit silent except for the wind. History would call the operation by its chosen name, Vengeance, but those who flew it knew another truth. It was not rage that guided them, nor triumph that followed, only the quiet arithmetic of war, the meeting of coordinates, courage, and consequence at a single point in time. By late April of 1943, the jungle of Bougainville had reclaimed the scar where Yamamoto's Betty fell, only a few scattered. Aluminum panels remained visible from the air. Yet, across the Pacific, the ripples of that morning's ambush reached every command post, every radio room, and every pilot's briefing table. Operation Vengeance had lasted less than 20 minutes in the air, but its consequences reshaped the entire architecture of the Pacific War. At Rabaul, Admiral Junichi Kusaka, now acting as senior commander, walked the perimeter of the runway where Yamamoto's inspection flight had begun. His staff stood in rigid silence as he dictated an internal memorandum for Tokyo. The loss of the commander-in-chief is a national tragedy. The fleet will continue its duty without interruption. But privately, his staff diary recorded the truth chaos. No single figure in the Imperial Navy carried Yamamoto's blend of authority, intellect, and moral force. He had been the architect not only of Pearl Harbor, but also of every Japanese naval strategy since 1939. With him gone, the fleet had lost both compass and confidence. The immediate reaction from Tokyo was confusion disguised as calm. The Navy General Staff delayed public announcement for more than a month, fearing panic and loss of faith. Official communiques continued to refer to Yamamoto in the present tense, as if his spirit still commanded the seas. Orders already signed by him were post-dated. Fleet dispatches carried his name until early May. Yet among pilots and sailors across the Solomons, rumors spread faster than censorship could catch them. Men who had once cheered his name now muttered that the Americans could strike anywhere, any time, even at the highest ranks of the empire. Within days, the Imperial Navy instituted new security protocols for senior officers: no advance itineraries, no predictable inspection routes, and absolute radio silence on personal movements. But the irony was painful. The very system Yamamoto had built for precision and efficiency had also made him predictable. His insistence on punctuality and his faith in meticulous planning had betrayed him. The codebreakers at Pearl Harbor had known him almost to the minute. In Washington, the mood was restrained triumph. Admiral Chester Nimitz read the report in silence, then placed it face down on his desk. "We cut off the head," he said quietly to his intelligence chief, "but let's not wave it around." Only a handful of officers in Washington and Pearl Harbor knew the true source of the operation the JN-25 decrypts from Station HYPO and the 14th Naval District's Combat Intelligence Unit. Even among the pilots of the 339th, none were told that the mission had originated from a message bearing the Admiral's itinerary and aircraft number. The secrecy was absolute because the stakes were existential. If the Japanese suspected that their naval cipher had been compromised, the Allies would lose their single greatest strategic advantage. Every victory that would follow the Marianas, Leyte, Okinawa depended on that silence. Thus, Operation Vengeance became a ghost, a victory that could not be celebrated, a story that could not be told. Meanwhile, in the 13th Fighter Command's ready room at Guadalcanal, Major John Mitchell sat over a spread of flight logs, tracing the fuel curves that had brought them to Bougainville and back. The mission's perfection still felt unreal. Every coordinate, every throttle setting, had converged to a point of fatal symmetry. He wrote in his personal notebook, "I doubt such accuracy will ever be repeated. To find one man in 10 million square miles of ocean and jungle, then to reach him at the exact minute, is something beyond planning." Rex Barber, newly promoted, kept his thoughts to himself. He had mailed a short letter to the mother of Lieutenant Raymond Hine, the wingman who never returned. It read simply, "Your son was beside me in the air. He fought bravely and gave his life in a mission that will shorten the war." He did not explain the mission's purpose, nor did he mention the name of the man they had killed. In Japan, preparations for Yamamoto's state funeral proceeded under elaborate secrecy. His ashes, brought by cruiser to Yokosuka under cover of night, were escorted by naval cadets carrying swords reversed in mourning. On June 5, 1943, a funeral cortege wound through Tokyo beneath banners reading "Eternal Spirit of the Navy." Emperor Hirohito attended in person. A single white chrysanthemum was placed on the urn. The newspapers called it a ceremonial farewell to the architect of victory, though, in truth, the war had already begun to tilt toward defeat. In the United States, news of Yamamoto's death reached the public only after Japanese radio announced it. The Associated Press bulletin on May 21 read, "Tokyo reports death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in combat." No American official comment followed. Yet, within military circles, there was quiet recognition that something profound had occurred. A generation of officers who had feared the admiral's genius now realized that Japan's war machine would never again operate with such coordinated intelligence. Historians would later debate whether Yamamoto's death shortened the war by months or merely accelerated an inevitable decline. Strategically, his loss was irreplaceable. His successor, Admiral Koga, lacked his flair for combined operations and his understanding of American industry. Under Koga, Japan's naval doctrine turned defensive, reactive, and cautious. The brilliant audacity that had once defined the Japanese fleet, the same audacity that struck Pearl Harbor, was gone. For the men of the 339th Fighter Squadron, the weeks that followed returned them to ordinary missions: bomber escort, coastal patrol, occasional scrambles over the Solomons. But the morning of April 18th never left them. In the fair, humid dark before sleep, they still heard the engines beating in rhythm, the sea sliding beneath their wings, the sudden burst of gunfire that ended a legend. Years later, when the classified details were finally released, journalists would call Operation Vengeance the most precise interception in aviation history. But for Mitchell and Barber, it remained something more personal, a reminder that in war, perfection was measured not by glory but by cost. They had carried out a mission too secret to be honored, too decisive to be forgotten, and too heavy to be retold without silence. In the official history of the United States Army Air Forces, the mission occupied a single paragraph. It read, "On April 18, 1943, P-38 fighters of the 13th Fighter Command intercepted and destroyed an enemy aircraft over Bougainville, resulting in the death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto." Nothing more. But in the unrecorded spaces between the hum of twin engines, between two coordinates in an ocean of blue, lay the essence of Operation Vengeance, a line drawn by mathematics, flown by courage, and sealed forever by secrecy. By the summer of 1943, the Pacific had entered its long, grinding transformation from defense to domination. The death of Yamamoto had been both a tactical victory and a spiritual one. It proved that American intelligence could reach into the heart of Japanese command with surgical precision. But within the walls of Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, the quiet nerve center of the entire operation, the mood was not triumphant. It was monastic. The men and women who had read the message that sealed the Admiral's fate now worked in deeper secrecy than ever before, surrounded by the soft hiss of ventilators and the ticking of typewriters that turned intercepted code into history. Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of Station HYPO, sat in his narrow office with his pipe unlit, staring at a single sheet of onion skin paper marked JN25D. It was the decrypted text of the signal that had started it all, NTF 131755. The message had been precise: inspection tour, departure, Rabaul 6 o'clock, arrival Balalae 9:45. It carried Yamamoto's personal call sign. Rochefort had known, when the message was first translated, that this was no ordinary intelligence find. "We have the coordinates of a man's death," he had said to his deputy, "and he does not even know it." For weeks afterward, the cipher clerks continued their routine: intercepts, shipping manifests, weather reports, fleet summaries, but the weight of what they had enabled hung over every shift. The HYPO cryptanalysts were trained to detach emotion from data, yet this success had been deeply human. They had tracked a heartbeat through the static of war and guided a blade unseen. Rochefort's notes, later sealed in naval archives, contain one line written the evening after confirmation of the shootdown. "The arithmetic of war demands precision, but precision demands conscience." In Washington, the Office of Naval Intelligence compiled a classified summary for President Roosevelt titled Operation Vengeance. Strategic Analysis. It concluded that the strike had removed from enemy command structure its most capable strategist, thus depriving the Imperial Japanese Navy of long-range coherence. The file also carried a warning in red ink: continued compromise of JN-25, possible if publicity occurs. Public acknowledgement of operation is forbidden. Roosevelt agreed. When reporters asked about Yamamoto's death, the White House issued a brief statement: "The United States forces have achieved a successful interception in the South Pacific. Nothing more." Yet within the ranks of the Japanese Navy, the psychological rupture widened daily. Admiral Minachi Koga, Yamamoto's successor, was a capable officer but lacked the late admiral's intellectual gravitas. His staff was divided between those who wished to avenge Yamamoto and those who feared another devastating intelligence breach. The rumor spread, whispered among pilots, and coded in dispatches that the Americans had somehow known every detail of the commander's itinerary. Some believed in an informant, others in black magic. The truth that an enemy code, room 6,000 miles away, had read their words was unthinkable. In the Solomons, the 13th Fighter Command moved on. Major John Mitchell received the Distinguished Service Cross, though the citation avoided naming the operation. Rex Barber, too, was recommended, though his official record credited him simply with 2 enemy aircraft destroyed. The men knew the truth, but spoke of it rarely. Hines' bunk remained empty, his name stenciled on the footlocker that no one touched. When asked months later what he remembered most, Mitchell replied, "The silence after we fired." It was like the whole sky stopped breathing. By autumn, the Lightnings of the 339th had been reassigned to long-range escort missions in the Solomons campaign. Their success in Operation Vengeance transformed tactical thinking across the Pacific. The concept of deep penetration fighter raids, once dismissed as impossible, became doctrine. When the Allied invasion of the Marianas began the following year, it was the same principle that guided P-38s over Saipan and P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo, that the enemy could be struck not where he fought, but where he thought himself safe. Meanwhile, Japanese propaganda sought to mythologize Yamamoto's death. Newspapers printed idealized portraits of him seated calmly in his cockpit, sword at his side, eyes fixed on the horizon. They called him the immortal admiral and declared that his spirit had ascended to guard the empire's skies. But among officers who had served with him, the image brought more pain than pride. Commander Masatake Okumiya, one of his former staff officers, wrote in his private diary, "We have not only lost a leader, we have lost the future of the fleet." His mind was the only bridge between old honor and modern war. In November, American reconnaissance pilots flying over Bougainville reported seeing villagers collecting fragments of the wreckage aluminum turned into cooking pots, steel fittings used for tools. The jungle had swallowed most of the site, leaving only faint outlines of the Betty's wings. The remains of the crew had long been repatriated, but the place itself had become a quiet shrine. Allied troops, who later advanced through the region, found the wreck marked by a small wooden sign written in Japanese. "Here fell Admiral Yamamoto, loyal son of Japan." Back in the United States, those who had orchestrated the operation drifted back into anonymity. Rochefort was reassigned, his contributions largely unrecognized until decades later. The P-38 squadrons moved westward with the tide of war, from the Solomons to the Philippines. The name Vengeance disappeared from orders and communiques, replaced by the steady bureaucratic pulse of new offensives. But history has a way of amplifying silence. In 1962, at a veterans' symposium in Honolulu, Barber and Lanphier met for the first time since the war. The argument over who had downed Yamamoto reignited briefly, each man still convinced of his version. A journalist asked them what the mission had meant. Barber answered first. It wasn't about who got the kill. It was about proving that the distance between intelligence and action could be crossed by courage. Lanphier added, more quietly, we didn't just shoot down an airplane. We shot down an idea that anyone was untouchable. In the end, Operation Vengeance became more than an ambush. It became a parable of precision. It demonstrated that information, when married to discipline, could strike harder than any bomb. The men of the 339th had flown through 600 miles of ocean, guided only by silence, arithmetic, and faith in each other, and in doing so, they had shown what modern war truly meant. Not fury, but focus. Not chaos, but calculation. As the war pressed on, few of them would ever again see a mission so exact, so personal, or so consequential. The jungle closed over the wreck, the codebooks changed, and the radios went silent. But somewhere in the thin air above Bougainville, where contrails once crossed at the perfect intersection of time and geometry, the echo of that mission remained a whisper in the code, a proof written in fire. By 1945, the war that Yamamoto had begun and predicted had come full circle. The Empire's cities burned under the glow of firestorms. Its fleets, once invincible, lay rusting in harbours turned into graveyards. Yet in the silence that followed surrender, a strange truth began to surface that Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had never truly believed in victory. The man whose death had been celebrated as vengeance by one side and sanctified as martyrdom by the other had, from the very beginning, foreseen defeat written in numbers and industry. Decades of diaries and testimonies, uncovered in the 1950s from Japanese archives and Allied interrogations, revealed the same refrain. Before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had warned the Prime Minister, "If I am ordered to fight, I shall run wild for 6 months. But after that, I can promise nothing." It was neither arrogance nor false humility, it was calculation. He had studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington, visited Ford's assembly lines in Detroit, and understood better than any of his contemporaries the vast machine of American production. To him, war with the United States was suicide measured in steel. Those who had served under him remembered a commander both brilliant and haunted. In Rabaul, weeks before his death, staff officers noticed him growing distant. He spoke often of the wind turning. One aide recalled him standing at dawn on the airfield, watching squadrons depart for Guadalcanal, saying quietly, "We have taught courage, but not endurance." His insistence on visiting forward bases, the very habit that made Operation Vengeance possible, had less to do with ceremony than guilt. He wanted to face the men who were dying under his orders. In that sense, April 18th, 1943, was not only the day America reached for retribution, it was the day Yamamoto met the fate he had accepted long before. To the Japanese Navy, he was the embodiment of discipline. To his peers, a man of contradictions, gambler and realist, patriot and skeptic. When the Betty bombers lifted off from Rabaul, Yamamoto's final act of command carried within it a quiet fatalism. His flight plan precise to the post. Minute was the act of a man who still believed in order amid ruin. That same precision, intercepted by American cryptographers, became the instrument of his death. After the war, when Allied investigators questioned surviving staff officers, they found no bitterness toward the Americans who had ambushed him. Many believed it fitting that Yamamoto had died in the sky, as a sailor of the air rather than in a bureaucrat's chair. Admiral Ugaki, his longtime friend, told interrogators in 1946, "He died exactly as he lived, believing in mathematics and obeying fate. In Washington, the full story of Operation Vengeance remained sealed until the early 1960s. When the declassified files reached historians, they were astonished by the precision, the 600-mile intercept, the silence of the approach, the perfect timing. But for some within the intelligence community, the moral question lingered: was it assassination or legitimate warfare? Admiral Nimitz himself had once written privately, "He was a combatant commander in flight within a war zone. The target was military, the outcome strategic. But still, one feels the weight of the decision." For the men who had flown the mission, age brought clarity. Major John Mitchell lived quietly in Oregon after the war, avoiding interviews. Rex Barber returned to civil aviation, occasionally lecturing young pilots about navigation. When asked near the end of his life what he remembered most, he said, "We didn't hunt a man, we followed a line drawn by numbers. But every number has a name." In Japan, Yamamoto's legacy evolved from symbol of war to cautionary figure. His portrait still hangs in the Etajima Naval Academy, beneath an inscription carved after his death: "To fight without hatred, to serve without illusion." For the generation that rebuilt Japan from ashes, he became less the warrior of Pearl Harbor and more the prophet of consequence, the admiral who had seen too clearly how modern war would consume its makers. And so, the mission once called Vengeance became, in retrospect, something different. It was not just an act of retribution, but the closing of a circle, the meeting of two minds across an ocean. One who had built a war he knew he could not win, and others who ended it with the precision he would have admired. The jungle where he fell is quiet now, the air thick with vines and birdsong. But if you stand there at dawn, you can still hear what both sides heard that day: the distant thunder of engines, the hum of inevitability, and the silence that follows when history holds its breath. The years after the war were kind to few and honest to fewer. For the men who had flown the 600-mile reach to Bougainville, the triumph they carried home had no parade, no citation that spoke its true name. Operation Vengeance was buried beneath layers of classification, sealed in cabinets marked ultra-secret. To the public, the mission was simply an interception. To the men who had lived it, it was a secret that whispered in their sleep. Major John W. Mitchell retired quietly in the late 1940s, teaching mathematics at a small college in Oregon. He rarely spoke of the war, though on his office wall hung a photograph of a P-38 taken at dawn, twin booms cutting through mist, a plane that seemed to fly toward infinity. His students sometimes asked if he'd flown one. He would smile and say only, "Long ago," in a different kind of classroom. In his journal, found after his death, he had written one line that could have served as an epitaph: "Precision is mercy when it ends the long arithmetic of killing." Rex Barber stayed in aviation, flying commercial routes across the Pacific, the same vast spaces where once he had hunted a man. In interviews decades later, he never raised his voice nor claimed credit. "I was one of many," he would say. "We were instruments, not authors." When the old argument over who fired the fatal burst reignited in the 1990s, Barber shrugged it away. "It doesn't matter whose bullet it was," he told a reporter. "It was the mission's bullet, not mine." Thomas Lanphier, by contrast, entered public life, carrying his version of the story like a medal. He gave lectures, wrote articles, and sparred with historians over the disputed kill. Time dulled none of his certainty. When challenged by Barber's supporters, he replied sharply, "History is written by those who remember to write." But even he admitted, near the end, that the operation had changed them all. "You fly a mission like that, and the noise never leaves you," he said in 1976. "Even in silence, the engines follow you." In Japan, the silence was heavier still. The nation that had once adored Yamamoto rebuilt itself upon a foundation of forgetting. The ashes of Tokyo mingled with those of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, countless unnamed soldiers. Yet in Nagaoka, Yamamoto's birthplace, a small museum rose beside the Shinano River. Inside, under glass, rested a single relic, his stopped watch, its hands frozen at 9:45. A placard beneath it read simply, Time ceased. Honor did not. Visitors bowed before it not in celebration, but in reflection on the cost of obedience, the weight of destiny, and the strange mercy of precision. Across the Pacific, at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum, a P-38 Lightning stands polished and silent. Children walk beneath its silver wings, unaware that its shadow once crossed the coordinates of a man's death. The placard tells only the sanitized version range, speed, armament, service dates. But in a small side case, beside the photographs of Bougainville, lies a piece of twisted aluminum and a line from an intercepted Japanese diary recovered after the war. He flew toward the front lines, knowing the winds of fate were waiting. In 1985, a reunion of Pacific veterans was held in Honolulu. Americans and Japanese sat together beneath the same palm trees, where once their fleets had warred. Barber attended, silver-haired, quiet. Beside him sat an aging Japanese officer who had once served under Yamamoto at Rabaul. The two men shook hands without ceremony. The Japanese veteran said softly, "He respected courage. He would have respected yours." Barber nodded, eyes lowered. "He died doing his duty," he replied. "So did we." They shared a silence that said more than any medal. When the full details of Operation Vengeance were finally declassified, historians called it one of the most precise and ethically complex missions of the Second World War. But the language of analysis could not touch the truth the pilots had carried, that war is made of moments when calculation and conscience collide. They had flown by numbers, but returned marked by something beyond arithmetic by phase our age, the knowledge that perfection in war is never clean, only final. Today, over Bougainville, the jungle has reclaimed everything. Roots have swallowed the crumpled bones of the Betty bomber. Vines crawl over rust and silence. The air is thick with the hum of unseen insects. Yet sometimes, in the first light of morning, villagers say the forest seems to tremble, as if stirred by a low, distant thunder. Perhaps it is only the wind in the canopy, or perhaps it is the echo of twin engines crossing a sky that no longer remembers, but has never quite forgotten.